In 2019, I sent an email to Andrew Kern introducing myself and mentioning to him that there is a small group of teachers here in Melbourne who are interested in classical education. Andrew was filled with joy and the communication continued. In 2018, I decided to buy and read a book called Classical Education, The Movement Sweeping America, which was written by him, along with Dr. Jean Edward Lees Jr. I started listening to the podcast channel Ask Andrew, produced by the CiRCE Institute, and after 6 months I was convinced that Australia needs a classical education movement. ACES was formed in 2021 with about 100 supporters from all over Australia. In 2024, ACES has over 500 supporters, an executive committee, representatives in some states, and is growing. We have a website, a monthly newsletter, social media apps, online professional development, YouTube videos, online conferences, and now are at the initial stages of creating Australia's first ever classical curriculum, from kindergarten to year 12. From nothing came something. Despite our humble beginnings, we continue to make progress and still have a huge amount of work to do. We will continue no matter what may come. If you would like to help us, please email us. Andrew, Katerina, it is an honour to have you both in Australia. You are the first leaders in classical education from the US to ever visit our shores. I'm certain that people in Australia will fondly remember this tour. On behalf of ACES, I thank you for never giving up on us, for following the movement that, although in its infancy, will flourish and grow in the next few decades and beyond. The CiRCE Institute continues to inspire so many Australians through its many activities. We look forward to hearing you speak tonight, Andrew and Katerina, and also the publication of Volume 1 of your new book, Andrew, which is happening very soon. Enjoy the rest of this tour, and God willing, we look forward to seeing you both again here in Melbourne. Our partnership that was forged 6 years ago has just become stronger.
I'm Andrew Kern with the CiRCE Institute, and I'm very honored to be here. In 1993, I helped start a school called Providence Academy in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And in 1994, the very first Association of Classical and Christian Schools conferences was held in Moscow, Idaho. You probably all heard of it. It's cold there. It's not the one Hitler was trying to beat in World War II. And while we were there, 67 people attended. And that was the classical movement in America in 1994. Today, there's over 1,000 schools. There's tens of thousands of students experiencing something like a classical education in one of the many varieties. Tens of thousands of homeschoolers. I think I said already over 1,000 schools. There is a movement sweeping America. It's changed the colleges. They've added programs. They've had, well, the surprising secret to me was colleges want students. And they want students who can read, write, and calculate. And they weren't getting them. And then the classical renewal came along, and they started getting those students that they were dreaming about. As a result, 30 years later, it's a different country, educationally. In teachers' well, here's the biggest indicator of how much it's changed. I do teacher training. I have been since, well, it's ironic. But when I started my first school, helped start a school in 1993, I was appointed lead teacher, and I got to train the other teachers. I had never taught in a classroom before. It's the American way. Shortly after that, I was consulting in other schools. And I would say things like, when you're teaching, you're trying to cultivate virtue in the children. And I would say, how many of you have a teaching certificate? Because in the States, it's the Wild West. Anybody can teach. And I would say in the school, how many of you have a teaching certificate? And I would typically get about half the teachers would raise their hands. And I would say, when you were being trained to teach, how much time did they spend in your teacher program learning how to teach virtue to children? And they would laugh. Until about 2012, 2013. Then I would say, how many of you learned how to cultivate virtue in students while you were at teacher's college or while you were getting your teacher training? And there'd always be one or two, maybe three, that would be on the faculty of the school. That wouldn't laugh. The rest would laugh, but those two or three actually did hear about cultivating virtue in students. That's a big change. That's a colossal change. I don't know how you measure it, but it's a colossal change. Let me tell you a story about a girl named Beatrice. One day, she had two dreams. She was lying down just to relax in the afternoon. She's about 19 or 20 years old. She's lying down on her settee in her living room. And as she puts her head on her pillow, she goes into something like, I don't know, a trance, a vision. Nobody knows if she was just daydreaming or had an out-of-body experience. But as she was daydreaming, she started to see a world, a whole beautiful, big world. It had rivers flowing through it. The rivers were on key, right? In other words, you know how water kind of flows in makes a pretty sound, it's melodic. And if it hits a rock, it's able to still sound good. And the birds would sing on key. Everything seemed to be in harmony. Every now and again you'd hear a crow. Every now and again you'd hear a dog bark, and that would break the harmony a little bit. But they had a role to play. They were guardian creatures or predators, so they had to be a little bit out of key with the rest. But basically, the world that she was experiencing in her imagination was a world that was in harmony with itself. It was a world that, most of all, when she would imagine it or see it, she felt at home there. She felt like she belonged there. She felt like she was a part of it and should be a part of that world. And so she cared about it. She tried to take care of it. She tried to get to know it. She tried to understand it. And she found that sometimes she would maybe, I don't know, step on a dog's paw or something, or bump into an animal that was trying to rest and disturb it. Or she would do things that would hurt whatever it was that she was interacting with. But she cared about it. And so she would pay attention. And she would try to stop. And she would learn about things precisely because she heard them. And she didn't want to. She wanted to have peace with them, but she also wanted to see them, I'm going to use this word right here. Flourish. She wanted them to flourish. She wanted them to be blessed. And so she didn't want to hurt them. So, when she did hurt them, she would do something to fix them. She might heal the dog's paw, whatever it was. Well, another thing that happened was she found that there were other people in this world. And she wanted to share it with these other people. So they would get together and, frankly, they would just enjoy the world together. They might sit and stare at a sunset. They might paint a tree. They might write a poem about a tree and then have an argument about whether you could ever see anything as a poem as lovely as a tree. And they would get into long debates about these things. A beautiful world, but one that had to be shared. And she was so happy and so peaceful when suddenly she felt a poke in the side. And she stood up and looked around and there was nobody there. But as she was turning back to the world that she was imagining, it just dissolved. Right in front of her eyes, it dissolved. And what she was left with was this great big wilderness, except for one huge exception. Unlike most wildernesses, this one, the ground, the land, instead of being a firm rock that you can stand on, was like ocean waves. There was nothing in this soil that was nourishing. It was rocks and sand, but there was also nothing in it that was stable. It was chaotic. It was moving around like waves of the ocean, except not with that regular, that rhythmic flow of waves cross waves, disturbing waves. Everything was chaos. Everything was out of control. And she became obsessed with standing still. She became obsessed with trying to find a place where she would not be thrown down or even destroyed. She became obsessed with just flat out surviving. And finally, after a little while, she saw something like a boat coming by, but it was broken up. It wasn't, you couldn't really have a boat on that sort of scenario, could you? But there was a boat coming by, broken up, and people were on this boat, basically to survive. They were clinging to the sides, or they were clinging to planks from the boat, and a big wave came by and knocked the boat over and fragmented it up even more. And the people who were on it or near it, they broke into little groups, competing for the planks, trying to survive. And then, because it was just an afternoon dream, she had the good luck of waking up. Which, by the way, my middle grade creative writing teacher said, never end a story with, and then she woke up. But I just did. Thank you very much. Now, I have a question for you. If you lived in that first world, if you lived in that first world that she was imagining or dreaming, what kind of habits would you develop? And if you lived in that second world, what kind of habits would you develop? Habits of thought, habits of behavior, emotional habits. Have you ever noticed how important emotional habits are? What kind of emotional expectations would you develop living in a world like that? And I ask you that question because in our imaginations, we tend to live in one of those two worlds. There isn't really either one of those. There isn't really any world that, except the Garden of Eden, that's as perfect as that first imaginary world is there. But underlying this world that we live in, underlying the brokenness and the pain and the sorrow that we live in, the question becomes, does it mean anything? When you look at a tree, is it telling you anything? When you watch an ant crawling along the ground, can you watch the ant's behavior and learn anything from it? Or is it just arbitrary? Does it mean anything? And is it ultimately, underneath everything else, is it ultimately one? Is it ultimately in harmony? I know that it's broken now, but will it always be? And was it always? And is our task to help it attain some sort of unity? Do we have a role in making it more what it was made to be? Do we have that kind of a role in this world? Or do we live in a world that is desolate, chaotic, meaningless, and basically tries to destroy us? I ask the question because historically, we've gone through a very significant transition, especially I would say as Western thinkers. If you woke up in the year 1500, you lived in your imagination in a world much more like that first world. I'm oversimplifying, I know that. But that was your expectation. That was what you imagined the world to be. But between 1600 and today, first that world, which we could call a cosmos, that world became a mechanism, just a machine. And then that mechanism became an ongoing self-perpetuating scientific experiment. In other words, it was a world that was creating itself by seeing what worked. And then that world, in the late 19th and early 20th century, became nothing, became chaos, became a nihilistic world. And what we are living in today is a world in which every child has to figure out how to survive in that world. And I want to speak to you about the compassion that children need today because of the unbelievable challenge it is. We cannot survive chaos as human beings. We can't survive chaos physically because it kills us. But we also can't survive chaos emotionally. The old Greek word, well, I don't know the old Greek word, but the English word to describe the old Greek word, the old Greek concept for sickness was dis-ease. You have ease when everything's in harmony. And when you lose the ease, you have dis-ease. You have disease. Disease is fundamentally a discord. We can have discord in our bodies. We're sick. We can have discord in our minds and our thoughts. Or we can have discord in our souls or our spirits. But we are not made for discord. We are always looking for the key that we should be singing in. The fact that music that is dissonant bothers us is something we should cherish. Because it tells us so much about our souls and our spirits. And it tells us so much about what our children in this culture, in this world, are trying to figure out and how to endure. In fact, one of my problems with pop music is not that it's discordant and chaotic, but that it's too simple. That you have a 12 or 13 second discord that resolved into a chorus, another 15 second discord resolved into a chorus. But if you listen to Beethoven's Ninth, you're going to suffer for 70 minutes. So much discord, so much chaos, so much pain, but at the end, an unbelievable resolution. A resolution that only can be brought about after all those different themes that were in conflict are made one. Do you see? That's what our children need to learn how to experience. But they can't if they don't have hope. If they don't hope that there's some reason for the suffering, some meaning in the suffering, some resolution to the discord, then they can't handle it. And as a result, what most children in our culture, and frankly most adults in our culture, what they're trying to do is to create in this desert of waves, they're trying to create some little microcosm, some little orderly condition just to survive. And I want you to think about something for a moment here. I want you to think about the emotional challenge that it is when you've created some little microcosm and then somebody comes along and says to you, that's wrong. Can you imagine how unnerving that has to be? This is why our children, when they're looking for an identity, they're trying to find out who they are, they come up with models, or they're given models. Usually they're given these by adults. They're given models. Maybe a TV show gives them an idea. Maybe, I don't know, maybe some ideologist gives them an idea in a classroom. Somewhere along the line, they're given some identity, some sense of who they are, some sense of a small resolution of the discord that they can hold on to. And then some moralist comes along and says, no, that's wrong. Well, it might be wrong. It's probably a false god. It's probably going to end up disappointing and possibly even crushing. But if you come along and tell them that, what they're hearing is something, what it feels like to them is something diabolical. It sounds to them like you're an agent of chaos. It sounds to them like you're trying to ruin them. And that's why in our world, where nobody has a world that's teaching them what they should be and do, where the light doesn't mean anything, they'll grab onto anything. And if you challenge it, they'll be so angry at you. Have any of you read The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis? I can't recommend this book highly enough. In it, there's a paragraph that terrified me as a young teacher. He said that most people, this is in 1943 he wrote this, most people in every place in the world today are trying to build a post-human world. A post-human world. They don't believe in human nature. They don't believe that human nature is a gift. that it's the image of God, that it's glorious. Of course it's broken. But I think sometimes, I'm speaking to you as a Christian. I'm going to assume just for a moment that most of you at least are Christians. I think sometimes we Christians can focus so much on our brokenness that we can forget that we're the image of God. We can forget that human nature has been taken on by God himself and is seated at the right hand of God the Father. And we can despise ourselves, not for being broken, but for being human. And that's a terrible, terrible thing. To be a human is to be for a little while lower than the angels, but now higher. You are more precious than the angels. Your children are more precious than the angels. We don't tell them that enough. We get too disappointed with them. We get too frustrated with them. And I want to offer you a perspective that I've had to very gradually learn. And it's this. We are living in a threefold crisis in our age. Have any of you heard the term meaning crisis? This is a term that's kind of floating around the United States. The meaning crisis. Children are suffering from trying to figure out the meaning of life, the meaning of the world, their own meaning. But if we get a little bit more practical than that, I would suggest to you that we're also suffering from a deliberation crisis. Very practical, isn't it? Have any of you had to deliberate ever? Ever think about what you're going to wear? We always have to deliberate. We're always making choices. But we're not good at it anymore, if ever we were. Now, you might find this hard to believe, but in the United States, sometimes in politics, we don't deliberate terribly well together. I don't know if ever anything gets into the international news, but sometimes we don't deliberate well. I would suggest to you that we don't deliberate well because we don't know our meaning. But there's a third crisis that all of those other crises come from. And it's a glory crisis. It's a crisis of glory. We don't see the glory in the world around us, and we don't see the glory in our own souls, and we don't see the glory in each other. Can you look at your children and not see their glory? I think one of the greatest images available to the human spirit is the image of a mother looking at a newborn child, and the newborn child looking at the mother. I find this hard to understand. I find this hard even to imagine, but I'm told that the newborn baby, who can't really see yet, makes eye contact, searches for his mother's eyes before he searches for milk. That the first thing the child wants is not what Maslow would say with the hierarchy of needs. The first thing the child wants is to see his mother's eyes and to have his mother's eyes look at him and accept him and love him. And I want to tell you that never goes away. Because what we're created for is the moment when another set of eyes is going to look at us. And it's either going to say, he's either going to say, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your Lord. Or it's going to say, depart from me, I never knew you. If you can think of a higher glory than to hear our Lord Jesus say to you, in the presence of all the angels, of all the saints, of all the angels, of all the ages, of all the holy people you've ever known, if you can think of a higher glory than to hear Jesus himself say to you, well done, I want to know about that. I want to know. That's what we're created for. We can't forget that. But we haven't been telling children that for a long time now. As a result, we're suffering from a glory crisis. We no longer live in a world that is a gift from God, that is a stewardship that we're to care for and love. We now live in a world that we're just trying to survive. And so when we educate our children, instead of equipping them to love each other, to love the world that they live in, to love their neighbors, to love the Lord their God, we just teach them how to get a job. We just teach them how to get into college. We could be teaching them how to get crowned by the Lord Jesus. We could be teaching them how to love each other. And then those jobs and those college admissions become meaningful again. It was John Henry Newman who said, "The good is always useful, but the useful is not always good." It's a good simplification of what our Lord said. Seek first the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. We spend so much time worrying about food and drink, don't we? I have a question for you. I'm almost done, I promise. Who's the first person in the Bible to ever worry about food? And who's the first person to ever worry about what to wear? And why does she worry about it? You and I, we tend to get dressed to cover our shame. You know why priests get dressed? For beauty and for glory. That's what the Bible tells us. What we ought to be doing is putting on robes of beauty and glory, not just covering my shame. And I entreat you, as you think of your students, as you think of your children, see their glory, even if they're having a terribly difficult time showing it to you. Because sometimes what it takes for that glory to be realized is for somebody other than the child to believe it's there. I believe that's the fundamental function of a teacher, the fundamental role of a parent, is to bring out the glory that's potential in you. And that's why I love this sign language so much. I want to offer you the definition of Christian classical education that we use at the CiRCE Institute. Very simply, we say it's the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. Education is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. And how do we cultivate wisdom and virtue? By nourishing the soul, which is a real thing. Nourishing the soul on the true, the good, and the beautiful. And when we do that, miracles happen. Souls become healthy. Justice, righteousness, beautiful artwork, all these things come into existence because there's souls that are capable of doing it. Because they're healthy. They're not in disease. They've found ease, or as our Lord puts it sometimes, rest for their souls. This motto here says, Lux et veritas floreant. Let light and truth flourish. I love that, because if they do, you know what else will happen? Children will flourish. We've got an opportunity and an invitation in this time, in this day, that the world hasn't seen, I think, in at least decades, maybe centuries. We're going through a transition. The world is changing very fast. Dusk is coming. It might be dusk now. What the people who wake up in the morning have is going to depend on what you and I preserve for them. Our fundamental task might be simply to preserve the wisdom and the virtue of the ages that we can hold on to so that we can pass it on to them, and then for us to go to sleep. That might be all. If that's it, it's worth it. Because they are. But there might be more than that. It might be that the Lord has a role for us. It might be that someday we'll have our children stand beside us And they will be so beautiful and so true and so good that our hearts will be overwhelmed with joy and gratitude to a God who alone can make something like that happen. And with that, I thank you, and I'd like Katerina to address you and talk about.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. It's kind of surreal. I'm getting the chills seeing Australia on the brink of something really big, and just I feel so honored, so blessed to be able to witness it and to play the small part that CiRCE Institute is able to play. I'm here to talk about the classical education that I received, and the risk that I feel in that is that I might accidentally present it as though I received the ideal education. I most certainly did not, but I am deeply, deeply grateful for the education that I did receive. So as I was thinking about what to say tonight, I was struck by the goodness that has been bestowed on me in my education. So in some sense, this talk is just a giving of thanks, first to God and the gracious gifts that He poured out on me in my education, and then also to my own father, who is sitting here and played such a key role in my own education. So I'll start when I was young, start at the beginning, which for me really wasn't kindergarten, because for us education was just always happening. It's a common theme in what I'm going to say tonight, that it wasn't just in the school, certainly not just in the classroom, but all of life was a way of learning. And when we were very young, my siblings and I were exposed to what would normally be considered great literature reserved for the secondary school. So Shakespeare was a common experience in my home, starting from, birth, because we would watch it frequently. And it didn't really matter what age you were participating in family movie night. So you would watch Shakespeare. And one of my fondest memories was being 4, 5, 6 years old and acting out much ado about nothing with my brothers in the backyard. And we just felt like these Shakespearean plays were ours to play with from a very young age. And later, did this go out? It did? Okay. Oh, now it's back. Later, I realized when I went to school that there were certain books that I was not supposed to have read yet because they were for the older kids. But luckily, my parents didn't reserve the good, true, and beautiful for the later years. They offered those to us in the very, very early years, even before we could understand them. And I'm so grateful for that. One example of that is that when I was 6, I fell in love with a poet named Dante. And I read Dante, and of course understood almost nothing of the words on the page, much like the Latin and Italian version I bought in Italy, and still read of Dante. But even though I didn't understand it, I knew the words were beautiful, and what I did experience was my father reading it to me, much like he read Homer to us over our lunch breaks, or in the evenings when we were wanting him to stop. But I actually did it secretly. It wasn't cool, but I actually wanted him to keep going. So he read it to us, and I remember one time when I was 6 years old, and he was reading to us in the Inferno, or Paradiso. Maybe I was reading, I don't really remember to what extent it was dependent reading, but I do remember Dante coming into an experience of God, the vision that he has of God. Of God as this beautiful light, and how Dante explains this revelation and this journey that he's gone on to see God. And that stuck with me. And I think that even if that were it, if that were the only classical education I received, that would be enough for me to then go on in life and yearn for that. I don't know if you guys know the artist Edward Burne-Jones, but he paints these scenes of these beautiful medieval images of beauty itself. And he describes it in his letters to his wife, saying that he sees this vision of beauty, and he yearns for it so badly that it causes him physical pain. And I think that's what, to some degree, I was given as a gift at such an early age. This longing for beauty, this vision of beauty that I did not understand. But I spent the rest of my life knowing that it was there, knowing that I could search for it. I then I was homeschooled then through elementary school, or most of what you guys would call primary school, I believe. And I had another gift in middle school, in that I was homeschooled completely at this time. So I was in and out of homeschool and private school, so sometimes I was taking courses at a classical private school, and sometimes I was doing courses at home. And in my middle school years, I was what you might call an annoying student. So I wanted to kind of go off and do my own thing, which my parents, this is one of the beauties, I believe, of classical education, is that it adapts well to the students. I'm one of 5, and we each received a very different education, but all classical educations. And for me, I wanted to sit in my room and read and paint and sew clothing, and I do my math and my Latin, but I really wanted to understand science as well. So I'd read science textbooks and do the experiments and learn on my own. And then, so I had these great years of just exploration and gathering and learning. And then, of course, because it's classical education, memorizing lots of poetry, memorizing hordes of scripture, and just really filling up a treasure trove for me to pull on later in life. Then in high school, I ended up going to a classical private school and then taking courses in the evening. And it was there that I experienced for the first time a separation in content we would call subjects. This idea that you have to go from one subject to the next and that they're not all intertwined, which reveals just how unclassical that classical school is. We're all on a trajectory, right? We're not fully not classical and we're not fully classical, right? We're somewhere in that spectrum. So I went to a high school and started to feel a little frustrated of the frustration of wanting to explore everything and then having adults tell me there's a limit, there are boundaries to what you're allowed to explore. And then that just continued when I went into college. Especially in science class, I was accustomed to being given a problem and then finding ways to solve it. But now, for the first time, I was given a problem and the steps to solve it. As though all learning is the same as just following directions when you get an IKEA bed and you have to put that bed together, you're just following directions. That's what you're doing now in science. And that was very discouraging for me. So I decided to carry on and get my own classical education through college and then into my master's in England. And then I initially thought I would never go into the family business. I want to go off and do my own thing. But that vision that I had in the very early years of my life stuck with me. And I knew that I had to keep pursuing the true, the good, and the beautiful. And so I ended up becoming a classical educator. And in that time I went to Uganda. And I was teaching there, and I was in the first classical school in Uganda, and we had a similar situation. We had to figure out how do we put the classical curriculum, or how do we do the classical curriculum, classical education, within this context of a state-mandated curriculum. But that was quite a challenge. Not only that, but I was teaching some of the poorest students in the world. Some of my students didn't even start kindergarten until they were 12 years old because they were orphaned or they didn't have food at home and they were just trying to survive. And here I was teaching them Shakespeare and Homer. So for the first time, I really had to come to terms with what I was doing and have a good answer for why classical education, what are you offering these children? But when I came in, they had learned education, or they'd been accustomed to the idea that education was just giving the right answers or repeating what the teachers told you and not really thinking about it, not really knowing things truly. And so when I came along and started teaching them about ideas and showing them that they could grapple with big ideas like justice and truth and goodness and beauty and class, I saw those students come alive. And that made me see that this education is truly for everyone. It was during that time that I started fostering a little girl, fostering to adopt actually, and she was living with me for 3 years. And in that time, she attended a classical school that I was teaching in, And she was learning English as she was living with me. When she first came to live with me, she didn't speak any English and I didn't speak any Luganda. So we learned each other's languages through children's books, reading children's books. And eventually, she'd memorize lots of poetry, and we would recite our poetry as we were standing in line or riding our motorcycle to work. And she came to really love it, and obviously gained fluency in English. And she so internalized poetry that she would start talking about her day through different poems that we memorized, through the metering and the rhyme of different poetry. And I do remember one day where I asked her what year Rome was founded, and she didn't know. And I really almost panicked, but my friends told me to calm down. She's 55. It's going to be okay. But in my mind, we should have these key things, these pegs to put information on so that we can have a conception, a robust conception of human existence. But I decided it was okay, she was only 5. This was the first time that I think I became consciously grateful of my classical education in a really, truly profound way. And looking back on it, I think it might be the thing I'm most grateful for in my classical education, because the government deeply failed us. We were meant to finalize the adoption, and it fell through. The laws were changed. I wasn't allowed to adopt her. It was very, very unjust the way that I perceived this experience. And I felt like Achilles. I felt like I finally knew Achilles. I read that book probably 15 times at this point in my life. I taught it almost every year in my career teaching, and I thought I understood it. But when I experienced injustice and the trauma of injustice, and my whole conception of reality fell apart, I knew that I had to get to work putting it back together. And that is the skill that we learn in the art of memoria. This is one of the things we emphasize deeply in classical education. Because really what we're doing when we're remembering is we're reshaping ourselves. We're putting our concept of reality back together. We're remembering. We're recollecting. We're collecting all of these things. So when the world fell apart, I had that treasure trove from my childhood. I had chapters and chapters of scripture memorized. I had lots and lots of beautiful passages memorized from literature. And so I went to work weaving my world back together. And I did that through myth. I started writing myths. I just make up piles and piles of myths to try and make sense of the world and make sense of what had happened. And then through that, I was able to heal. And I think that's what classical education gives us. All of the information that we can memorize, that's wonderful, that's great, that's a good thing. And all of the ideas that we contemplate, that's a marvelous thing. Because it brings us closer to a vision of God. And that's something that we should never take for granted. But to heal the human soul, that's ultimately what we're trying to do here. And that's why I'm so incredibly grateful that I was given a classical education. Thank you.
Let me kick off really quickly. Andrew, you've both got a very strong faith base to your why behind classical education. I didn't ask the audience how many of us do or not, but what is someone to do if they don't have that faith base? Can you approach classical education without a faith in Christ first? Or is it a prerequisite?
Well, the Greeks did it without a faith in Christ. I like the question very much because there's two very different ways that Christians can approach people who are not Christians or beliefs that are not Christian. And for the sake of simplicity, the two words I would use to describe them are antithesis or fulfillment. Is Christianity opposed to everything around it? Is it antithetical to everything around it? Or does Christ fulfill everything else? And I would argue that the only things that Christ opposes are the things that oppose Christ. That if you humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, then he will lift you up. And I believe that's true also with curriculum. I believe it's also true with Homer, for example. I believe that Christ gives us more insight into Homer's Iliad and Odyssey than the ancient Romans could have ever had. But then the question is, well, what about a non-Christian then? A person who doesn't begin with Christ? And I would say that, first of all, nobody anywhere ever operates without faith. It's a question of what you put your faith in. Science, for example, is based on the faith that the material world is knowable. This is not a universal belief. It's not even a common belief historically. Most people in the world, probably even today, don't believe that the material world is real or knowable. I think it would be safe to say, and accurate to say, that in the Hindu tradition, the world is Maya. And if I understand Maya correctly, it's an illusion. The world is an illusion. So why would you develop science if the world is an illusion? In the ancient world, if you were an Egyptian, you probably thought the hippopotamus was a god. If the hippopotamus is a god, it's not a hippopotamus, and therefore you won't study it as a hippopotamus. But if the hippopotamus is a hippopotamus, then you can study it as a hippopotamus. So all of us begin with faith. It's a question of what are we putting our faith in? I want to make an argument, I want to posit a position that might sound unusual, but I've come to believe this very deeply, and that is that you can know something without believing it. You can even know something without admitting it. There are things that we simply know. And if we start questioning some of these things that we simply know, our minds can fall apart. There are things that it's not worth asking whether we know whether this thing is real or not. And so we have to be very careful about where we place faith and where we just think, faith and reason, for example. You only reason if you have faith already in something. So I probably sound like I'm talking this in circles, but what I'm trying to get at is all of us begin with faith, and it's just a question of what we believe in. Those of us who are Christians have made a very radical move in that we believe not only that the world is knowable and so on, and that there's philosophical sense to it, but we actually believe that there was a historical moment in time when God risked everything, you could say, where he risked total embarrassment by entering into time and space where things can be tested. So it's actually subject to evaluation, and God doesn't even mind if we evaluate the historical record behind it. And that changes things. And if somebody comes to a different conclusion, I will now get to the point. Sorry. If somebody comes to a different conclusion specifically about Christ, then I would contend that a classical education would still be exceedingly valuable, because the premise behind a classical education is that the raw human faculties, the natural human abilities, are worth cultivating. Now, I think you'll find it more exciting and valuable to cultivate those natural God-given human faculties like memory, right? Like the ability to read, use language, calculate. You'll find it more exciting to do that if you believe they're a gift from God, if they're an expression of the divine image. But if you believe that your life is utterly meaningless, or you believe in a different religion, then you'll still find that if you can use language better, you'll be better at what you're trying to do. You'll still find that if you can calculate better, you'll be a better human being, all other things being equal. So I think the desire to attain virtue, the desire to be an excellent human being, is a universal human craving. And if you're not a Christian and you're saying, oh, I don't want to do this because he's a Christian, I would urge you to do it then just out of self-respect. Do it because you love yourself or you love your child and you'd like to see yourself or your child become wise and virtuous. It's a good thing to be wise and virtuous.
We'll have questions from everyone in the audience. You have someone ringing around with a microphone. What's your name? Connor has a microphone over there, so if you catch Connor's attention, he'll come to you and wait for you until you can ask a question. While we're finding out first, I've got this question, I have another one for you. Can't think someone off the back of the Connor. Go for them. So let's go to Nietzsche then.
Yes.
Yes, you like Nietzsche?
Yeah, well, what do you mean? it's fun to talk about.
So God is dead. We have killed him, and who shall we replace him with? So my question is, who has the world, the society, who have we replaced him with? If you accept this premise that we've killed God in the public square, is how I understand we need.
There's a philosopher in the 18th century who said, man is the new holy of holies, and they give consciousness to the divine. I think this was probably an inevitable consequence of the Renaissance and the great weight that they put on mankind. I think mankind could not hold the weight that was put on him, and so it was only a matter of time before they made man God. And then, of course, you get the world wars, and what's left after World War I, artists were in particular were looking around and saying, well, what is man if we can do something like this? And then you get art that's just meant to shock and just truly disgusting, ugly things, because they thought that's all that we were as humans. And this is because we put so much emphasis and so much weight on mankind, thinking that we give consciousness to the divine. So first, the answer to your question, it was man. We thought that humanity could carry that weight when we thought we killed God or that God was dead. But then man crumbled. I don't think it's mankind anymore. And I think that's evident in the fact that we have students who are identifying as animals, at least in America. I don't know if you have that phenomenon here. But we have students demanding a litter box at school, which is very disturbing. And so now I think we've attempted to make probably science the next God. We're grappling. I mean, anything. You ask, all these different pockets of society have a different God now. And that gives me hope in some sense, because it's only a matter of time before they do find God, because that's searching. And search, when you ask a question, you can find the answer. So I actually have a lot more hope now than I would have had for the world 100 years ago. So, there's hope.
Hello, John.
Well, thank you. Characteristically, your first question actually was my original question. I'm not a Christian, and I thank you for asking the question. And
Thank you for being here.
I found the answer very, very fulfilling.
Thank you.
My backup question, and I think stolen my first one, is, Katerina, you mentioned being again ethnic wars and grappling with how do you promote or contend with classical education in the context of mandated government curriculums.
Yeah.
As Matt knows, I'm a libertarian, and I'm deeply concerned about the national curriculum being imposed on us by the federal government here in Australia. And I noticed that ACES, and presumably CiRCE Institute as well in America, count among their activities political lobbying. So I'd love to hear from the classical education perspective, what would you like to see when it comes to curriculum and competition, potentially in curriculum, and how could we go about that here?
Well, I think we would both say, in short, the 7 liberal arts. We should be teaching the 7 liberal arts and letting that be the foundation of our curriculum. I'll say that. I know that Andrew has many more thoughts.
But what about choice to the question? The competition of curriculum?
Yeah, on the political side, it's hard for us to know what you should do in Australia. I think the best way to get your way in politics, in my opinion, most of the time, whether this be common everyday politics at work or broad national politics, is to submissively obey and do what you're told to do, at least verbally. Is to see the value in what they're asking you to do and not oppose it outwardly, but to work with it. And thus Katerina's answer of the 7 liberal arts, I think, is both a practical day-to-day solution and a political one. Now, we haven't gone into what are the 7 liberal arts, and regrettably we don't have the time to go into it entirely, but I'll just say that that there was a framework of how the ancient and medieval and early Renaissance world understood reality, And it's still part of how we think today. It was a framework that said, first of all, there are liberating arts that are preconditions for further study. You can't gain knowledge if you can't reason logically. You can't gain knowledge if you can't speak sound grammar. You can't gain knowledge if you can't reason together in a community. You need arithmetic. You need geometry. You need music. You need to understand time and space. You need to understand necessity and agency. All of these things are prerequisites to any kind of what we might call scientific knowledge. That's what the 7 liberal arts taught, those skills. And the focus then was on what we today would probably call, what we are beginning again to call intellectual virtues. The prerequisite for all later learning is the intellectual virtues. Now here's the thing. Given that you can't learn anything else without first learning those things, it's a really good idea to teach those things first. And when we flatten, we almost have a flat earth society governing education all around the world. All knowledge is the same plane. You can take an 11th grade boy or girl and give them a philosophy class. Well, what I can tell you with absolute certainty is there's not an 11th grader on the face of the planet Earth that can do philosophy. They can learn about philosophy, I can grant you that, but they're still learning how to read. They're still learning how to reason logically. And you're asking them to figure out what Heidegger meant by being? Can anybody here explain to me what time is? Can anybody here explain to me what change is? That's what philosophers are dealing with. And what happens when you flatten knowledge like that is you render it inaccessible. You just discourage people, and in order to make it work, you reframe what knowledge is, and you start pretending. Everything becomes an intellectual game. And that's, I think, what's happened to much of modern education. You go to school to play a game for a while. Some people are good at it. They like it. They flourish at it. So they become college professors, forgive me. Some of them. Not all of them by any means. Some of them. Other people don't like the game. They can't wait to get out of it. So what I'm suggesting is, first, you devote all of your attention toward teaching a child how to read, how to interpret a text, how to have a discussion. I'll even reduce it to this. The single one thing that you should always be teaching children how to do is deliberate. Every lesson you teach a child should involve learning how to deliberate. When they're really good at that, then it becomes possible to do the natural sciences. Then they're capable of learning some things about the material, the forces that govern the universe, we call that physics. The elements of matter, we call that chemistry. Dynamic change within organic systems, which we call biology. You can't learn that sort of thing if you can't read well. And that's why what typically happens in a science class all around the world today is children don't study science. They learn how to read very badly. They learn how to read textbooks that tell them what questions to answer. That's very, very, very poor reading, to read a text without even asking your own questions. And so we're pretending to study subjects. And what I'm urging is, stop pretending. Teach them how to think. Teach them how to deliberate. Then teach them the sciences. And then they'll be done with high school and you won't be able to do anything more. But after the natural sciences, then they can study the ethical sciences. Then they can study politics. Do you know what politics is in the classical tradition? Anybody want to guess what politics taught people? All right, I'll tell you to save time. How to build virtue into a community. That's political science in the ancient world. Ethics, how to become an individual with virtue. Everything was governed by virtue. And politics was dominated by a very simple concept in the ancient world and the medieval: friendship. If you can't be a friend, you can't have a community, and if you can't have a community, you can't have a polis. Economics, household customs, how to have a healthy household. That's what economics taught. Now it teaches you how to destroy a household with data. We've inverted all these things by creating an artificial structure of reality artificial structure for our minds that we then impose on reality. Because we don't live in that first world that I was talking about in the dream. We don't believe in that world anymore. We believe in this chaotic world trying to destroy us. And that's why what Katerina was describing in your question, we turn to any God we can find. Right? Nietzsche, when he said God is dead, he didn't mean God. He didn't believe in that kind of God anyway. What he meant was the imaginary construction that we've built up in the European mind over the last 1,500, 1,800 years. It doesn't work anymore. We're abandoning that. But what are we going to replace it with? And he predicted what happened, chaos. Right? That's where we are. So what we need to do is teach children how to deliberate and how to reconnect to reality, not how to succeed in school, but how to reconnect to reality and to learn how to love it and to enjoy it, to delight in it, to see its glory, to love it, and then to think about it. Because you will not ever understand anything. Let me just state this as dogmatically and obnoxiously as I possibly can. You will never, ever understand anything that you don't love. You can't. You can understand about it, you can learn about it, but you won't care. You will know how to get control over it, possibly. You might know how to rule it, but you will never understand it. I'll just illustrate that with a simple illustration and then stop. Imagine somebody who gets a puppy, a child gets a puppy. By nature, children love puppies. So what happens? They love the puppy, they learn about it, they come to understand it, they bond themselves together, and they live together forever and ever in every moment. They're inseparable, right? But what happens if a person gets a dog so that it can fight in the pit? That second person might know dogs very well in order to fight in the pit, but they will never truly understand dogs for the simple reason that they're only using the dog. They're not man's best friend in that case. They might be man's best gambling tool, but they're not man's best friend. Therefore, that second person will never understand the dog. And understanding follows love, always has. This was understood by Plato. This was understood by Aristotle. This is a New Testament teaching. Thomas Traherne said it beautifully in the 17th century when he said, "You will never know the world until you learn its value." If you don't know the value of something that's valuable, you don't know that thing. And so the love precedes the understanding. That's what we need to be showing people. And that requires learning how to see reality. Do you see? Receive it. Receive reality into your soul. Receive it with love. And then you can understand it. And that's what we need to teach our children how to do. That's what the arts are for.
And in light of the Australian curriculum, if you're teaching this and you're focusing on right reasoning, training up these skills in your students, you will also cover the Australian curriculum.
Right.
It's just you'll do it inadvertently. And you'll do a whole lot more as well.
Mm-hmm.
So many questions, but I will not hold the mic. Connor, who have we got?
Yes, hi, my name's Ben, and I was about more than 10 years ago, I was involved in just experimenting within a Christian school, trying to set up a classical stream in the school. I was a Latin teacher, so
Great.
I was always roped in.
Optime.
And we did a program last time, a couple of other things like that. But it was very, very difficult because I think in the end, what happened was that, generally speaking, most of the teachers essentially reverted to just a more traditional form of modern education. And so really, I'm thinking in a very much more regulated space in Australia compared to America. We're already talking about curriculum issues. The real issue is actually developing teachers, where you must have all the official training and so on.
Yeah.
So how do we go about, in our current system, forming the sorts of teachers that we actually need? I'm not just thinking, I'm just doing a sort of like an old-fashioned version of modern education, something genuinely classical.
The first thing I would say, if you're wanting to be a truly classical teacher, or if, let's say, I was starting a school and I had a bunch of teachers coming on who don't know or weren't classically educated, I would honestly have them spend months on fairy tales and myths. So learning to think analogically, learning to come into participation with a thing in order to know it, learning how to respect a thing as you come to know it. These are what we learn through great stories that are analogical. So I would highly recommend starting with fairy tales and myths. And then there's some wonderful books to read. The most important book, I think, is Norms and Nobility by David Hicks. That changed the way I teach more than any other book. And then C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man, and his Space Trilogy, which is just basically the Ransom Trilogy, which is the story version of The Abolition of Man. So there's the conscious realization of what we're doing through those nonfiction books, and then the poetic knowledge, the internal knowing. Because when we come to knowledge through participation with a thing, it comes through our soul first and then to our mind. So there's often a lag, and I think that lag is fine. That we know something before we know it. So first, if we want to be a classical teacher, we should know how to do it before we know how to do it. Which means trusting your intuition and going back to the basics with reorienting our mind to think analogically.
Katerina and Andrew, thanks for coming to Australia today. It's a pleasure to see you here. Look, I've got two questions for you actually. As a homeschooling father and seeing the amount of hands here and a lot of familiar faces from the schooling community, I was wondering, what role does homeschooling families and what role does the church community play in taking out that rollout and movement all across in the United States? And the second thing, which basement and foundation you found more efficient, establishing the classical education on top of homeschoolers and that community, or within the educational system?
Oh, what a great question.
Wow.
What a great question. Sociologically, it's always been the case that if the world is going to flourish, it's because mothers love their children. And the more that can be expressed, the more powerful it's going to be, and the healthier the world is going to be. In the United States, homeschooling has absolutely transformed education from coast to coast at every level of political order now. If you teach in a school, even a private Christian school, you're going to have social structures that are difficult to work with, pressures that come from outside, a lot of challenges that you're going to have to contend with, and politics. Our president, Woodrow Wilson, back around 1912, had been the president of Princeton University, and somebody asked him when he was governor of New Jersey, why don't you go back to being president of Princeton University? And he said, I can't stand the politics. Governor of New Jersey said that. I don't care how small the school is, it's going to be political. It's very hard. And part of the reason is because there's no bottom line. But what you can do in the homeschool setting, first of all, you get incredibly quick feedback. So that if something isn't working, you learn fast. You don't have an administrator in a school that pours thousands of dollars into a book and then it doesn't work, but they say we've put thousands of dollars into that, we're going to have to use it for 3 years before we can change it. Right? You have so much more flexibility and adaptability. So I would encourage any of you who are not true believers in homeschooling to do everything you can to support the homeschoolers. They will shake up this. They will shake the foundations of education like nothing else can. And they'll get very rapid feedback and they will gain great wisdom. What's happening now in the States, by the way, is that classical schools can't find enough degreed teachers. They're turning to homeschool moms whose kids have grown up now, and they are making phenomenal teachers. Phenomenal teachers. And for all those reasons, we can't value homeschooling enough. The devotion and the dedication. But schools also have a role to play that's crucial. And I think by necessity in Australia, you'll have to do more schooling until the until your system cracks up. Now, the thing about managerial systems is that when things don't go the way a manager wants something to go, what the manager almost always does is say, I have to manage more tightly. Eventually, the manager squeezes everything so hard it just dies. It won't be terribly much longer, I don't think, before the Australian regulatory regime of your schools begins to seriously crack. It can't measure as much as it's trying to. And the best thing you can probably do is over-comply. Then they can't keep up, right? Just report far more than they want to know. And then that will exhaust it. Destroying freedom never helps a system flourish. Right? And I think what I keep hearing is that's what's happening here. So do the best you can to comply and submit, over-comply and over-submit, but at the same time fight for the freedom within that to simplify, to teach mimetically and Socratically, and to teach the 7 liberal arts, and do it in such a way that goes beyond what they're asking for. And you'll keep proving that you know, forgive me for just putting it this way, but you'll keep proving that you know better than they do what the children need, because it will work. That's the most polite cue I've ever had to stop in my whole life.
Andrew, what about the not so much the regulatory battle that parents might be up against, but the sociological pressure that I mentioned, going to the shops and picking up something from Facebook Marketplace, just the pressure a lot of parents feel, the shame, the embarrassment of this isn't a real education. We're still in that nascent stage in Australia, homeschooling.
Yeah.
How can people approach that?
Well, my favorite story about this is I was at a homeschool convention in Houston, Texas once upon a time, and there was a lady at a booth that she probably was 4'10", 60 pounds, and I went up because it's a convention. You go up and you talk to people in their booths, and her first question was the typical homeschool question, which is, "How many children do you have?" And I said, 5. And she said, "Oh, that's a good start." So I've always used that ever since. It ended up that she had either 12 or 14 children, I forget what. But it's that same thing. If you believe in life, live a little. If you believe that life should be preserved, have children, and then raise them. And I think what I would say is this, that I'm the sort of person who, if I'm walking down the sidewalk and there's a complete stranger whom I'll never see again, and he's on the other side of the street walking in my direction, and I just stumble a little bit over a crack, I'll probably turn pink with embarrassment. Right? I'm that insecure. Having said that, to hear our Lord say, "Well done," man, that would be sweet. And if you're hearing other people put you down or you're afraid of their opinions of you, remember His. Right? He tells us in the Gospel of John that we can't believe in Him if we're afraid of men, if we're afraid of women, if we're afraid of people's opinions of us. So at a certain level, just look higher. Don't worry about what people think of you. And I'll add this: most of them don't think you're an idiot. Most of them think you're strange, but only in the sense that they don't understand you. And I would recommend maybe having 1 or 2 questions that you have handy to ask them that might possibly lead to a conversation. Maybe even a very direct one like, do you think it harms children when they spend more time with their parents?
Wow.
Yeah, something like that.
Wow. It's a credible amount of work.
Questions are always great. I'll just leave you with my motto. The quality of your life is determined by the quality of the questions you ask. Right? The quality of your time in the grocery store line is also determined by the quality of the questions you ask. Sorry.
Oh, I'd also just like to say, make good friends. I mean, if you can, it seems like a lot of you are homeschooling here tonight. If you need community, if you feel isolated and alone, then it's going to be really hard to walk this journey. And there's other people who are walking it as well. So I highly encourage you, even if it's just talking to a stranger tonight, to find your community, because they're the ones that are going to lift you up when you need that.
Yes, we'll go to another question, but that's very important, because I've noticed a lot of our homeschoolers
I'm sorry?
but a lot of our homeschoolers are weird. Right? Yeah, sure. No, what I mean is...
Most people are weird.
I know, I'm one of them now, but a lot of them are just copying the curriculum from school and doing it at home. And what you're suggesting come across very much. You know, they're running away from the indoctrination of whatever work movement is happening in schools. And they're holding on for dear life, just trying to educate their kids with the maths curriculum that they downloaded from the New South Wales government website. Anyway, go on.
Andrew. A question for you. In these times where the art of community or the spirit of community is kind of been lost, how can classical education help us to rebuild to that virtue? I guess coming from a Pacific Islander background, new to Christianity over 100 years, we see it from the other way around. We see the great development in Western society and what they've done, but then we see the other aspect where the community aspect is almost kind of disappeared on the foundations.
Yes.
Andrew, so how do you build within this community to reteach the foundation of the virtue that it may come naturally in a very closed circuit of the world to obviously do it in a Western context? How do you build that village in the Western way of thinking?
Wow. Thank you so much for asking that question. I believe that we have made our lives so easy that we don't need community. And what makes community valuable to us is when we can't get by on our own. And as a result, it's a little bit like what we need is a massive cold shower, right? In other words, we have worked so hard to protect ourselves from every bit of suffering, from the suffering of working in the garden, right? From the suffering of childbirth, from the suffering of going hungry, from the suffering of getting too hot or too cold, that we can spend our whole lives inside weather-regulated homes, go to a grocery store and buy our food, and literally never, well, not literally, because we feel empty, but almost literally never suffer. And I don't honestly know a way that you can build a healthy community if there's not a way for the people to come together in suffering. I truly don't know. And therefore, we have to re-embrace taking up our cross. We have to re-embrace martyrdom. We have to re-embrace going without. Perhaps what it is, maybe this would be the easiest thing. Maybe this would be the easiest thing, that we should take something like a vow of poverty. And I monks take the 3 vows: poverty, obedience, and chastity. And then sometimes we think, well, all right, I'll get married and then I don't have to do that. I don't think we should approach it that way. I think what we should do is when we get married, we should understand that we are taking a vow of poverty, obedience, and chastity. In other words, nothing is mine anymore. Right? And the chastity is modified, of course, but I can't just sleep with any woman. I've made a vow. So there's a chastity. And then there's obedience. Right? We're told to submit to our spouses in marriage. Both of us. Right? And so our wills we need to surrender our wills to the people around us. First to our spouses. We just need to surrender ourselves to our spouse's will. We need to be chaste, and we need to live poor in spirit, certainly, but we need to hold our possessions more loosely. When we see somebody who's without, we shouldn't be evaluating what are they going to do with this if I give them this resource. What we should be asking is, how will this affect my soul if I give them this resource? And then I think perhaps by re-embracing hardship and poverty ourselves, by following our vocations because we're called to them instead of because we're frightened and the world is shifting around on us and we're worried that God might not provide for us, we have to re-embrace that need. And when we need each other again, then we will have community again. And for that reason, maybe if all of that is too terrifying, let me put it this way. Let's build schools that are so hard and so challenging and so countercultural that we can't survive without each other. Right? And then I think we'll have the kind of community that you're talking about. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that question. I hope you'll keep asking it to everybody you meet, in the grocery store line especially, when they ask about your children. Just kidding. But thank you for asking that question. I hope I didn't dodge it, because I sure didn't mean to.
Interesting thought. Rather than create a place for people to slippery slide into easily, you're suggesting to make something, a mountain, enticing for them to want to climb, something difficult to join in.
Yes, thank you, yes. I talked earlier about how we lost our glory, right? If you don't see the glory of something, you won't go after it. I fell in love with a woman when I was 19 years old because she was so glorious. And I could see it with my soul. I didn't need tests and quizzes. She was so glorious. She had a dignity that I could hardly bear. And she let me walk around Oak Park, Illinois with her, looking at houses. It was because of her glory that I took on the hardship of winning her over. And it took a while, because I was really annoying. But I finally won her. We have to find these things that are worth paying the price to get. And that means seeing the glory again. Really learning. And let me just quickly say that you see the glory of something not through some fancy techniques. You see the glory of something by looking at it receptively, by giving it your attention. Do your children drive you crazy? Do you not see their glory? Just take a few moments just simply watching them be who they are, without you saying anything or doing it. Just watch them attentively and receive what you see into your soul. Don't evaluate yourself based on whether they're as great as you want them to be right at this moment. Just receive them and watch what happens. Watch what happens to your perception of your child.
As I would say, further in.
Yes.
We have another, see how many questions we get in the last 10 minutes. Just so you know, the Wilson car park closes at 10 p.m. if you're in there, which is in 45 minutes. And we need to be out there by 9:45, half an hour. So 10 more minutes, who have we got? Question?
Hi, so Ashley. I'm a parent from a school that's considering classical education. We're currently surveying families, etc. My question is not necessarily my personal question, but it's a question that keeps coming to me from the families currently at the school, which is, how does a classical education work for children with severe learning difficulties?
Right.
We don't want to exclude our current students, and we have a high population of severe learning difficulties. So I guess my question personally is, how do I explain that this is a good model for them to those families?
What's Cheryl's last name? Swope. First, I would strongly recommend a book by Cheryl Swopes called Simply Classical. It's written by a lady who homeschooled 2 children with severe learning disabilities, and explains how it was the classical approach that made the difference for them. It's a human way of teaching. Yeah.
There's also a book in the back called Reading for the Long Run that's talking about that question, specifically in terms of reading. But I've also taught quite a few students with a wide array of learning disabilities. And I will say the mimetic and Socratic mode of teaching were the most powerful tools I could have ever been given. And classical education is honoring to the whole person. It's very focused on using the whole body to learn. Especially things like memory. You're getting outside, you're interacting with living things, plants, animals, you're getting your hands dirty. And then you're also learning from embodied types. So it's not this abstract, sort of distant, unapproachable sort of education that we imagine when we think of great books in philosophy. There's certainly an aspect of the abstract, but at its core, it's very, very human and really very embodied and physical.
More questions?
G'day, my name's Cam. I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. So I've gone from theology and now looking into game development. And so from there, particularly with kids and such, like the modern myths, by my understanding from what I'm hearing, is something that has been generally lacking in reading or perhaps in spare time. Could you fill in the area of thought around that? Because as one who's into what people would appreciate in their spare time, would also be something that you could fill in with this classical mindset.
Video game builder does seem to embrace what you're talking about. Myth.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
Vicarious.
And leisure.
Yes.
Yeah, leisure is at the heart of classical education. In fact, education, do you guys know what the Greek word skole literally means? From which we get school? It means leisure. Education is a leisure activity. Right? That's what you all felt in school? It's a leisure activity. Plato argued that education should begin with play. The children need to play. We work them so hard. We're working them so hard so that they can get used to working so hard, so that they can be adults working so hard who make their children work so hard so they can just keep working so hard and then die. Leisure is what makes life worth living. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's tricky for me because I don't play video games. I have watched my husband play some, which he tells me that I would like. He explains the story, and occasionally the characters go into libraries and I think it's time to read a book, but then they don't read the books in the games. It's usually when I come into the room and then leave again. So I'm not speaking from any experience in terms of video games, but I would say if those myths are archetypally true, if we're talking about universal myths, and the games are allowing you to participate in those myths, I think that's fantastic.
We've got one more question before we wrap up. Does anyone take the last question?
I suppose my question is slightly different in the fact that how does classical education from the start work with children not wanting to, say, go to a higher education, teaching, but towards trades? How can that help children who may not be scholastically inclined but more trade inclined? How can it help them develop to become a plumber, a sparky, any builder, that sort of thing?
Can I expand that as well? If you could also cover just this utilitarian aspect. I mean, that's what our education is built on. Our government, some things built to outcomes. What's the point of you teaching me about Sisyphus? I need the boy to be able to do these 12 times tables.
Well, I have another child who's a bricklayer. Sisyphus means a lot to him. No matter what your career profession is, you're going to be able to understand it and interpret better if you have good mythology in your mind to understand it, and also Bible stories, and also the ability to deliberate. If you want them to be at the bottom of the rung at any trade for their whole lives, then don't let them learn how to read, don't let them learn how to deliberate, don't let them learn how to calculate and think on their own. If you want them to be successful in their trade, teach them how to deliberate, how to read, how to use language, how to communicate, how to make decisions. Those are the things that make it up. And I don't mean that in a cheeky sense. I think that we have too little respect. You don't. You obviously respect it. But as a culture, we have way too little respect for physical labor. This comes back to the community issue. You want community, build a house together, right? We have to respect the work of the body again, the work of the hands. The Lord, in the Bible, it says to the thieves, stop stealing and work with your hands. Teach those who were thieves to work with their hands. Working with your hands is a precious gift. Learning how to think well doesn't undercut that. Right? It strengthens it, it fortifies it. So does that help? Does that answer your question? Another really good question.
Very briefly, the primary question perhaps that we ask in every subject in classical education is, should X, Y, or Z do X, Y, or Z thing? And so regardless of what you're going on to do in life, every day you answer 1,000,000 times for yourself, should I do this thing? And in your interactions with people, you ask, should this other person do this thing? You never have an emotional response to another human unless you've already answered that question. So becoming more aware of that process and thinking through what we ought to do is just fundamental to being a human, no matter what you go into.
First of all, thank you everyone. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Katerina. On behalf of ACES, we would like to present you with some gifts.
Thank you.
To thank you immensely for coming all that way to help us lay the foundations in Australian soil of Christian classical education.
Oh, thank you.
We hope we can remain friends forever. Thank you.
So we're supposed to
Forgive the drink.
I just got some new friends. Who's going to join me?
Oh, open it. Oh, yeah. No, I don't know. You're looking for me for cues, cultural cues on purpose. I didn't get a gift. I'm still in where I didn't get a gift.
Here, you can have
I was
this.
trying to be subtle, but so much for that.
This is thank you both very much. We'll give you a big round of applause in a minute. But first of all, a quick word from the organiser tonight, John, who I think is trying to start a classical school, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much, Matt. Thanks, Andrew and Katerina. My name is John Smythe. I'm a parent and school teacher, and together with the ACES team, I helped to organise this event tonight. And I want to thank you all for coming on a cold, is it winter now? Cold winter's night, out of your busy lives to come along here. Thank you so much. The reason we invited Katerina and Andrew to come out to Australia is because the ACES team, and I'm sure many of you feel the same, when you hear about classical education, you feel inspired. You see the glory that Andrew referred to earlier, and you want that for your children, and you want that for yourself. I really want a classical education for my children. I really want it for myself too. I also want it for my students. I'm a school teacher, as I mentioned, and Victoria is the only state in Australia now, Tasmania also, but every other state has some classical schools, in some cases several. Victoria's the only one where we're lagging behind in this area. So another reason why we wanted to organise tonight was to hopefully get enough people together who are interested in classical education to want to start a classical school, or 2 or 3 or 4. And some people refer to some obstacles that might be in the way of that tonight. Some questions mention those obstacles. Well, those obstacles are being overcome. As I mentioned, every other state virtually has classical schools already. In some cases they call them liberal arts. They're largely interchangeable terms. So it's already happening. We're already there. It's already beginning. It's already underway. The only question is how long will it take to get up and running here? Another aspect of Andrew and Katerina's visit, as well as speaking to the public and getting people interested in classical education, they've been meeting with key people. So they met with several politicians. They've been meeting with heads of universities. They've been meeting with influential people, journalists and other people who are all very interested and very supportive of classical education. In 2 days' time, Andrew is going to do a podcast interview with former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson. Tony Abbott, former Australian Prime Minister, has helped to organise for Andrew to give a lecture in Sydney later this week. There's a lot of people that are very interested and want to see this happen. So I say all that to say this is all those obstacles, they're being moved out of the way. I know 2 groups tried to start classical schools here in Melbourne, they got knocked back. We're going to keep trying until it happens. And so I want to make a call to action to you tonight. If you're already homeschooling, fantastic. I want to encourage you to join together, if you're not already, join together with other parents and form those communities that Katerina mentioned. There's a wonderful lady at the back named CiRCE Harvey. She's the lady behind the bookstore there. If you aren't already part of a homeschool cooperative and you want to join with other parents, please talk to CiRCE. She can help you to organise that.
If you are interested in classical schooling, as in having your children in school, can I just get a show of hands? Who's interested in that? Who'd like to? Yeah, fantastic. There's a priest, Father Dylan. Can you put your hand up? Father Dylan is in the process. A question also alluded to this. I've turned his school to a classical school. Yeah. St. Philip's in Melbourne North is trying to go classical. If you're interested in that, please talk to Father Dylan. He'll be standing at the back. Sorry, put it on the spot. Father Dylan, he'll be standing at the back, and he'd love to talk to any parents that are interested in that. Perhaps there's parents who are from the Orthodox faith, and they would like to send their kids to an Orthodox classical school. I encourage you to come and talk to Con. There's lots of classical communities that are very interested in that. Talk to Con. He will connect you together. If there's other people you don't fit into one of those camps, please come and talk to me. I'd be happy to discuss with anyone those possibilities. I think we need several. Melbourne's a big city. One school's not going to cut it. We need several. And I would love it if tonight was the birth of several new schools. Maybe program. Maybe God's called you to take action and help to start a school. Andrew did when he was 29. Started a classical school. It's maybe there's more challenges here in Australia. We've got more hoops we've got to jump through, more forms we've got to fill out, but it's worth it. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Another aspect of Kern and Katerina's business is they're providing training. So they've already spoken to 100 school teachers up in Queensland. And they're going to run a professional development seminar for teachers and homeschool parents here in Melbourne tomorrow. Now, it's already pretty full, but I don't want anyone to miss out. So if you are interested, if you've like what you've heard tonight, you want to come along tomorrow to hear Andrew and Katerina explain in more detail how does classical education work. Come and see me afterwards. We might have to knock some holes in the wall. You might maybe have to stand at the back, but I won't let anyone miss out if you want to do that. So come and talk to me. That's tomorrow, all day from 9 till 3. And finally, if you'd like to support the work of the good people at ACES that are doing a lot to try and bring classical education to Australia, if you'd like to support that, there's a donation bucket as you're walking down, you'll see a golden bucket on the table there. If you'd like to put something in there, we'd be very grateful. If you'd like to make a donation by card, then Cherie, please see Cherie, the lady at the bookstore, she can help you do that. You all know the myth of Prometheus, right? Prometheus, he was a cheeky fellow who went up to Mount Olympus and he stole fire from the gods and he brought it down to Earth. Well, I regard Andrew and Katerina as our American Prometheuses. Wow.
You know what happens to him, right?
Yeah. I'm sure that won't happen to you. Look what's happened here. You've got some great gifts. That's what's happening. But these pyromaniacs have brought the fire of classical education from America to Australia. And this is starting some fires. It's very exciting. And I hope you really enjoyed tonight. I'll pass it back to Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you. First of all, I want to say thank you to you because these two lovely people are going to be gone out of our country in 1 week, and who's going to be left with the joint? It's us. People like you, amazing people. Thank you for being part of this, and thank you for whatever you're about to do in your family, your homeschooling, your communities, whatever you're about to do. Be bold. There's a number of us, and it doesn't take everyone. It just takes a few of us. We might be able to. I was ready to give up on Australia. I was ready to come to the US. Maybe it's worth saying. All right, thank you. Good night.